Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Data Integration Roundtable, part of the Senturus webinar series. Agenda for today, we'll do some quick introductions of the experts who are going to be speaking to you. We'll talk a little bit about just kind of the background of data integration, and then we'll head right into the roundtable discussion, and there'll be a lot of back and forth with our team. So joining us today, we've got Brad Green, Solutions Architect and Data Engineer here at Senturus. Brad has been with us for a long time. Most of us have been around here quite a bit, so lots of years of experience on the session today. And we also have Rick Fukunaga, who's a Senior Consultant here at Senturus. And third, but I guess maybe last but not least, Peter Gigopoulos. Also, Peter is a Senior Consultant here at Senturus, and these three are just rock stars when it comes to data integration. Personally, I've worked on tons of projects with all of them over the last many years. I'm almost embarrassed to say how many years, but yeah, we've got a great team assembled here today. As for me, I'm Steve Reed Pittman, Director of Enterprise Architecture and Engineering here at Senturus, and I'll just kind of provide the kind of overview for today's session. All right, so before we get started, we want to do just a couple of quick polls. This first poll has a whole bunch of options on it, so I'm not going to read all of the options to you, but go ahead in the window that's popped up there. The question for this poll is, which data integration platforms do you currently use? And so what we've done is we've put about 10 of the most common platforms on here, and you can check off as many of those as apply to your situation, but we're just kind of curious to get a sense of what platforms folks are using who are on the session today. So I see quite a few coming in. There's a lot of SSIS showing up. That's not surprising. SSIS is a very mature and solid product and heavily used across many industries. We've got some Informatica coming in here, a fair amount of Azure Data Factory, which also isn't surprising as more and more folks are moving to the cloud. We've seen a shift, some SSIS workloads have been moved to ADF, which makes sense. And share out the results. So I'm not sure if you all see the same view I do, so I'm expanding my window here to show all of the results in one place. Hopefully you all see that same thing. So you can see we came in, 58% of you answered that you're using SSIS, so not surprisingly a good solid crowd of that. A fair amount of ADF, some Informatica out there, smaller bits of Data Stage, Cloud Pak for Data, and some of the Oracle tools. Beyond that, we've got a little bit of other cloud, and I'd be curious actually for those of you who are using other platforms, if you want to just drop your platforms, just type a little note about them into the Q&A panel. I'd just be curious to know some of the other platforms that are being used out there. All right, on to the next poll. Let me get my deck going here. So we're also curious to know for a future webinar, if there's a particular platform that you'd like to see a deep dive in. And so we've got some of the big heavies who've been around for a long time, Informatica, SSIS, and Data Stage. We've also got others. So if there are other cloud platforms that you'd be interested in seeing a deep dive for, let me back up there, not just cloud platforms, but data integration platforms that you'd like to see a deep dive webinar. Just let us know. And again, you can put that into the Q&A panel if you have a particular platform that you're interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out and share those results with all of you. Again, about half of you would be interested in an SSIS deep dive. Second place goes to Informatica. Data Stage isn't too far behind, and about a quarter of you would be interested in other platforms. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop doing talking, most of the talking anyway, and we're going to start moving on towards our roundtable group. So we're going to start with the definition of data integration, and I will talk for this slide. So just generically speaking, data integration typically is about combining data from multiple data sources into a unified data set. And that can mean different things in different organizations. But in general, right, you're trying to take data that's not structured enough and get it structured in a way that's useful for your own reporting. And that can include lots of different activities. It can include cleansing, it can include ETL, it can include data mapping, transformations, and it can even include modeling. And of course, as most of us know today, there are an enormous number of solutions out there. I mean, the day, even though it's true that Informatica Data Stage SSIS, right, we can see from the polls today that those are still heavily used. Those are kind of industry standards that have been in place for a long time and continue to be very strong products. But there's also a whole universe of new tools out there. So it's a wild and woolly world. And just a quick view of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for data integration. So most of you have probably seen these over the years. And so you can see some of the different companies that have come in the sort of span between 2014 and 2022. But you'll note that the leaders have more or less stayed the same. We've still got Informatica and IBM over here in Gartner. And we've got Microsoft up here now. I'm a little surprised that Gartner didn't have Microsoft up there even in 2014, because SSIS has been, at least in our experience, SSIS has been heavily used for a long time. All right, and with that, we're going to go into the live Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing the deck just because that's not very interesting to look at while we chat. And I'm going to introduce Rick, Brad, and Peter. We're all be on camera here in a moment. And so we're just going to start kind of some general questions and just kind of general discussion about data integration. And so I think for a starting point, guys, if we could just talk a little bit about how data integration has evolved over, say, this last decade, where we used to think about ETL as being like the thing you do, and you buy an ETL tool and that's it. But now you've got tools that do an enormous number of different things. You've got cloud and you've got on-prem. And could you just talk about some of what you've seen in terms of the shifts in recent years?
Sure. Who wants to
start?
start?
And remember to unmute your microphones also, guys. I know I had you turn on your video, but make sure your microphones are unmuted. Sorry, Brad. Go
That's
ahead.
okay. Yeah, I'm unmuted. So I guess that nominates me. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, first of all. And thanks for the intro, Steve. Yeah, things have changed a lot. I think that, I was thinking back the other day of when I first started with Senturus anyway. My first class was an ETL class, which is interesting. I spent 5 days learning that wonderful tool we call Data Manager. And I thought, wow, this is kind of cool, a GUI tool. Because up until then, right, everybody was writing SQL code, and everything was done in chunks of SQL and Oracle databases and everything. So yeah, I think things have changed a lot over the last, almost 20 years. We've gone from hand-coded SQL, and I think most of the world now is using GUI tools or something similar to that. I mean, if you're in a cloud environment, you might be using dbt, you might, be back to using Python. So the environment is varied and different, in some ways familiar, and it's interesting. I think things have changed a tremendous amount. We have tons of options. I mean, you showed that slide of vendors. That's a way busier slide than it was in 2005, right? I mean, we just have such an array of choices now that when people go out to look at what you want to use, how do I want to develop my data integration, my pipelines, moving data around the organization or from external data sources, yeah, you're spoiled for choice, and it's a difficult job. So I'll stop there and see, what Rick and Peter have to contribute on that topic.
Yeah, I think for me, and again, good morning, everybody, good afternoon. That what I've seen is, as Brad was alluding to, when you have all of these new players and new technologies coming in, it also has strengthened some of the existing platforms. Like for myself with Informatica, while the construct remained the same, there's been a lot of back-end technology changes that have give some, drastic improvements on performance, on how many rows it can process, and giving you as a developer some tools on doing some your own optimization within the tool sets. Specifically some of the functions in Informatica, they have this push down optimization, which based on your database platform can potentially push some of your routines and logic back to the database to try and give you, some better performance. And so these advances in technologies from other solutions have helped, start to robust, create a, even a better product. And, to some extent, that's why they still exist in the, that leader platform as they continue to push the platform, continue to improve it, not only on, the on-prem version, but even on the cloud versions of trying to make these solutions, be able to handle more than just a simple of data movement from point A to point B.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Rick. I think over the years, what I've found is we have to adapt a lot to, when Senturus finds a client, sometimes they already have an ETL tool. So we have to adapt to their environment. But a lot of it has been SSIS development, at least for me. And I've seen a large shift now going towards cloud-based solutions too. So I
Actually, Rick, I'm a little curious. I mean, since you
yeah.
mentioned the shift to cloud-based solutions, one thing that we're seeing more and more, of course, is that some of the traditional vendors are offering now both more like what we traditionally think of as on-prem solutions, even though many times today those on-prem tools are running inside a VM that's actually out in the cloud. But maybe could you just, I think each of you have some experience with this, so I'll just kind of like throw it out to all three of you. If you could just talk a little bit about your experience with working with the kind of traditional on-prem version of a particular tool and what you've seen with the cloud, the more modern cloud versions, and sort of where they have parity and where they don't.
I think because a lot of the cloud versions of the tools, for instance, Data Factory versus SSIS, some of the features are lacking in them. They haven't matured enough as much as the on-prem versions of them, and I think that's true with other solutions too. So for me, I prefer the on-prem versions because I know they work. I already have developed solutions with them. So trying to find the workaround in cloud-based tools sometimes it is challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have very limited personal experience in these particular realms, but I have seen a little bit of Data Factory versus SSIS, and I know just from my own observation, and I mean this has been a few years now, but at least at the time, like the way that Data Factory pipelines were constructed was really like they seemed almost like completely different beasts, even though they were built by they're both built by Microsoft. But my understanding is you can deploy. There is some way to deploy SSIS packages into Data Factory nowadays.
Yeah, you could
true?
Still use the Visual Studio, create your SSIS packages, and then deploy them into Azure.
I think some of those differences, like, in a lot of cases, the overall design, I mean, if you're looking at like, let's sit down and design a pipeline. I need to move data from one place to another, and that may or may not involve transformations along the way. In some cases, those cloud-based tools are designed for us in some ways for a slightly different process, right? we know that traditionally we had this lexicon of ETL versus ELT. And, as you guys know, it's a personal pet peeve of mine labeling things. We prefer to focus on what job, what process are you trying to build, and not get hung up on labels. So some of these cloud-based tools are, I think, intended to load data and process it in a fundamentally different way than these legacy tools, as we like to call them. And so when we shift to these cloud-based tools, we kind of have to rethink how we build pipelines a little bit, because the tools just are structured slightly differently. So I think you can kind of get there, but it is true that many of them are not as mature. And having had some recent experience with a cloud-based tool from a vendor that has newly released their cloud-based product, it is definitely something to consider, to look at how long a product has been on the market, and to make sure you have feature parity and that these tools do exactly what you expect from beginning to end. So true, yeah, cloud-based products are maybe not as mature, but it does very much, I guess I'm, in a roundabout way of saying, looking at the solution that you're trying to create and making sure that the tool is appropriate for the job is a very important thing, because we built things differently 10 years ago than we build things today, but in some cases you're still trying to do exactly the same job. So on-prem tool may be the perfect solution, but if you're trying to move lots of data from a Salesforce app that's already in the cloud to another database that's already in the cloud, something like Matillion and a Snowflake database may be the perfect solution. And it doesn't work the same way that SSIS does. That's my point. And maybe Rick and Peter will say, that's a bunch of, what? I totally disagree with you. So.
No, I agree with you. I think if you're going from cloud source to cloud target, having a tool that works in the cloud too, that I think that makes perfect sense. And there's different ways to move the data around. There's products like Fivetran that it's strictly really, you use that to move data from one point to another, then you do your transformations on the target side. So again, that's perfect ELT solution.
Yeah, I would say I have a couple of projects that I'm currently working on where we actually have hybrid environments where we have Azure in the cloud that is pulling in data from other cloud sources, but internally all of the data that they also blend in is an on-prem data set. So we've got this mixture of data we're bringing in through Azure. We're storing it in the data lake through the Azure data lake. And one of the nice things is, while some of the, like a JSON file, with the Mongo database, you can still get at it, with Informatica Power Center. It's not a direct and easy connection. You still can get it with some coding, where nowadays some of the cloud-based have these connectors to easily connect, readily available. A little different than previous models in which you were being licensed of how you can connect and limited to what you could use. Oh, you're just SQL based. Oh no, you want these other connections. There was somewhat of a fee for it. Now, when you have these solutions, especially when you're talking about Azure, they're available to you. You can configure it, move the data cleanly. Like I said, we're doing a hybrid of Azure to acquire the data, and then continuing to utilize some of the existing internal resources for Informatica for the data aggregation and the data mart creation, as well as master data management. And so, it does, there is that sweet spot, at least in this particular project, that this combination or hybrid solution is providing a very good solution for us. But just like anything else, looking at your data sources, looking at your objectives, will help in determine, which platform, which direction, do you want to go.
Yeah, that's an
Peter.
interesting, and maybe that's what you're going to say, Steve. So I'll just, but it might be interesting to explore that question of, when you have to deal with hybrid, how do people make a decision about sticking with a key vendor like Informatica or IBM or Microsoft and trying to use the same vendor for multiple data integration tools? Or do you go, well, okay, I'm going to use Matillion and Informatica and something else to try to solve all my data integration, needs? So I don't know. That's just an interesting point.
Yeah, that is a great point, Brad. And I mean, and this actually leads into a question that came in about, making decisions between, do I go on-prem, do I go cloud, do I go hybrid? And I mean, I think just from what you guys have said so far, the answer is probably it depends. But it led me to think about the question of what do you do? Like if you have on-prem data, but you want to use a cloud-based tool for your data integration, how mature are those tools today in terms of being able to reach into your on-prem data and pull out? Like, is that, I mean, I'm sure it's much easier to do that with an on-prem, integration tool. But if you have a cloud tool, like, are they fairly well evolved now in terms of being able to pull data from on-prem databases, or are they really more sort of designed and efficient, which I would expect when they're dealing with native cloud data?
I know from the project I'm on, some of the hurdles that we had is because some of our data was on-prem and some of the transformations in Azure, you can't really do it in the traditional sense of grabbing your source data and then running it through some of the transformation engines. You're limited more to the data flows, very simplistic movement. And so it's acquiring the data, storing it in the data lake, then you can then massage the data and then write it back out, to your target, which is on-prem. So there's a couple of, intermediate steps that you have to take. It's not just simply where normally you would just grab your data if it's in the cloud and you can manipulate it and then write it. There's a, that interim state of let me put the data in the lake. Now I can read that data, so you've got that interim step that you have to do in order to use that data and use the cloud tool from end to end. It's not a simple just direct connect and do your manipulations and then write to your target.
Yeah, I think for clients that have a significantly large amount of data internally, they haven't already lifted all their data to the cloud. In other words, it exists internally. Whether you think about that internal data as already existing in its internal cloud, I mean, that's a big decision, right? Because if you got a few terabytes or petabytes of data sitting, in a private network, you're probably going to think pretty hard about what you do with that data. You're not just going to say, okay, I'm going to hand that over to Amazon and then we'll go cloud with some cloud app, right? So that's a significant decision point for people to make. And it's not going to be driven by the tail of the dog, which says, oh, I want to use Data Factory, so let's just move all our data to, Azure, right? I don't think people would make the decision that way.
Yeah, I would think also that just like data transfer, like the performance of data transfers would be a consideration if you're pulling on-prem data. I mean, well, and not to mention the security aspects that you kind of touched on there, Brad. But I would think if you're having to pull a lot of data from an on-prem database out into one of these cloud tools, I would think that could be a concern, just performance and or just cost. I mean, each vendor has sort of different ways that they charge, for bandwidth for data moving in and out of the cloud. So I can imagine that can be a consideration also.
Yeah, I don't think it's practical to move huge amounts of data out of the cloud, process it, and then turn right around and move it back.
And bring it back. Yeah,
That doesn't
yeah,
make
that
any
seems
any
illogical.
You might find a scenario that makes sense to, if you're going to put your analytics. I mean, if we're talking about data integration for analytics purposes, which I think is really what we're talking about here, you might be able to make the case of moving it up to the cloud for analytics purposes. That way it's a one-way trip, right? You've got ERP systems internally, move that data up once and process it, and now it's available in the cloud for analytics purposes. That might make sense. So, yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to pause here for a minute just for a quick public service announcement in case everybody hasn't noticed. In the chat window, our own Scott Felton has posted a link if you want to get some time on his calendar. Just so everybody's aware, like if you have deeper questions about data integration or you'd like to talk to us about specific data integration needs that you have today, you can just use that link that Scott posted in the chat and spend some time with him. He's always happy to chat and talk to you about your current data integration needs. Also a reminder to everybody that you can enter questions into the Q&A panel. So if you have questions specifically for our panel of experts, you can type those in as we go along. So beyond the stuff we've already talked about, guys, I was wondering maybe if each of you could just talk about like one kind of real world example of an integration project you've worked with. And that may be, hybrid, it might be on-prem, it might be cloud only, but just kind of some of the like challenges and sort of considerations that come up in real world projects today.
So somebody else gets to go first rather than me this time.
Want me to flip roll a three-sided die?
Right. Yeah. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first on this one.
Thank
So I think for me, I've got a couple of different projects. One was, traditionally a pure on-prem solution where we had, Informatica and Oracle as the database in terms for our integration area. But in terms of the challenges that we faced, it was really more in dealing with multiple ERP systems, trying to coordinate and consolidate, 25, 26 different business units on different ERP solutions and trying to, create that federated, solution set. And, some were able to connect with directly, some, the old traditional, let me give you a CSV file and, FTP it over and then you process it. To one of the current projects I'm on now is that hybrid solution that I mentioned earlier, is going through and connecting to cloud versions of Mongo, a cloud version of an SQL database, an on-prem SQL database, some external metrics from the government in terms of census and population statistics that are then blended in and crunch, all on an on-prem, SQL, database that is used, to try and, figure out some, labor and employment trends. And so, different challenges, the cloud made it a little easier to connect to all these particular environments. But again, there's just like anything, there's still that initial setup that takes time to coordinate. And especially when you're transmitting across, the cloud and making sure, that PII data that's coming across is secured correctly, and that those tunnels are, created, those keys have been created so that nobody can, get access to the data that's not allowed to get access to that data.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm just going to choose Rick as the next. We'll make you last, Brad.
All right. One of the issues I had with one client, they had most of their business units were on one ERP system. Well, different copies of the ERP system, so they were distributed across multiple servers. but one of their business units was on a completely different ERP system. And so trying to consolidate their financials because they wanted to do planning. You take that data and put it into a planning software. That was a big challenge. And then you have to create a consolidated chart of accounts, a singular look at what the chart of accounts is. So mapping was involved. That required having to map one account in one of the business units to a consolidated account number. It took a while. Of course, we had to ask the business people to help with that type of mapping. Once we got that done, then they wanted to also consolidate some sales data. So across all of the systems, they had their own separate data warehouses, but now they wanted to consolidate all of it. So they had their bookings, revenue, and backlog all together in a dashboard. So those types of issues present some challenges to consolidate that data. But we were able to do it all with SSIS, and it became the standard for reporting for the company.
Do you find, actually, before we go to Brad, Rick, do you find that organizations have SSIS, workflows that have been out there like for years and years and years that they just continue using, or how do they tend to evolve?
Well, this particular client, we started development of their data warehouse with SSIS in 2012, I think it was, and it's still running today. With, over the years, it's evolved by adding additional subject areas. Most places start with sales, have one in a sales data mart, and then you do purchases, then inventory, and then it keeps growing.
Expand.
Operations.
Yep.
Yeah. So over the years, it evolves, but the base code, I think, has been in place for years, and I've done that for a number of customers, and yeah, it just works. It's true with a lot of different data warehouses too, other tools. Unless they change their ERP system, you don't have to touch the code very often.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just real quick, I would say that was the same for me. I've had a client where code has been in place since, with 2005 in terms of the Informatica ETL. Their processes remain the same. What's changed over the years is really just movement of where the data is stored. On-prem Oracle to off-prem Oracle, cloud-based solutions in Oracle, and then migrations to different database platforms. Like I said, now they're on SQL Server, so just a complete different, movement of where it's written, but the core of the code remains consistent. And like Rick says, as long as the process and the data acquisition components don't change, these marts have been running for now almost 2 decades, which is very nice to see that they're still getting value out of the information.
Yeah, that's an interesting. So before I launch into my little example, Steve, did you have something you wanted to comment on?
Something you brought up, Peter, actually, I hadn't really thought about, was the question of database platform migration. So you talked about how often like the kind of core ETL might have stayed the same over all these years, but the database itself might have shifted from Oracle to SQL Server, or moved out to the cloud. I'm just curious, if there are particular challenges any of you guys have seen where customers, it wasn't that they needed to change their integration tool, but it was simply that they had to, because their data was moving to a different database, like what challenges that creates with the existing code that's there. Like, are those difficult to accommodate, or maybe it's tool specific, but I'll let you guys tell me.
Yeah, for this one, the Oracle to SQL Server wasn't. It was a task that required a lot of effort, but it wasn't a complicated migration. Simply because a lot of the database technologies in terms of options of how the tables are created, are consistent. There may be some minor, features or functions that we had, to be aware of, especially if, some of the code we had were stored procedures. The one thing in particular that we've came across and is for those of us that have had Oracle is the use of the Oracle decode function that has been there, that is not an ANSI compliant function that doesn't work on SQL Server. So, you've got to convert all of those routines, to case statements to try and figure out, and give the equivalent. So that's the hard part of, okay, now we have to scan through, hundreds of pieces of potential code that exist and looking for, vendor specific functions. Very similar, almost if you're, maybe moving in a BI platform, if you've used, specific vendor functions there, you have the same thing on the integration side.
Right.
You just got to go and look for it to see, okay, what's going to break? Because of the fact that this code is using some vendor specific function that is not supported, or the new vendor doesn't have you got to figure out what is that new equivalent function that I need to put in place.
Yeah, that's why we recommend that you never change anything. No, I'm kidding.
Some,
All right,
but
well, thanks, Peter. Oh, Vic, you got
yeah,
one?
I got, well, I want to add something. Sometimes, oops, excuse me. Sometimes you have to change the database architecture for performance reasons. Like, you can load it, it's fine. But then when you start reporting on it, you have to, you try different techniques to speed up reporting. In one case, we had to change the architecture of the data of the table with column store indexes in SQL Server. That greatly improved the reporting, but slowed down the ETL. So you have to find workarounds in order to make everything work as you want. So, considerations like that have to be made too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people don't change database vendors too often, which is a good thing. I mean, there is often a tendency to push transformations back to the database, right? We face that often where it's something we all do. We push those transformations to our SQL statements. And of course, the more you do that, the more chance there is that you're going to have to rewrite things when you change database vendors. When you rely on the tools to do those transformations, it shields you from that, right? Because the tools are dealing with those transformations and you change vendors and it's not going to make any difference, right? I mean, that's the benefit of using the tool to do those transformations, is you don't have to worry about changing decode statements because those compiled C code and all that other stuff that's in those tools is going to deal with that for you. So that's the trade-off, right? It's can have it buried in your SQL, or you can let the tool do it, and there's various arguments, for one case or the other. So anyway, just thought I'd make that point. Peter looks like he wants to say something. No. Okay.
Oh, you're muted, Peter.
That's
or
all
you're
right.
just saying you don't have.
No, nothing to say. Just sort of agreeing with you, and just just ways of the worlds now.
Yeah, it is what it is. It depends on the people doing the work. So there were so many things said there that I wanted to comment on. I've already forgotten most of them, but so my example, rather, I've got so many different projects I could talk about, but maybe one that would be interesting for people to hear is one particular project where the client was utilizing a cloud-based solution, which was Data Factory, and they had basically, they didn't have any internal resources or expertise at all. In other words, the entire data integration ETL process was external. So we built all the ETL. It was all managed in the cloud. So they had Data Factory, Azure, security, everything was completely outsourced. And the business then took that data and had business critical reports. So what's interesting when people do that is there are certain dependencies that are developed when you make those decisions as a business to completely outsource your business process that delivers your data for critical analytics. And I think that it was interesting to see that. It was a good decision for many reasons, but you do have some downsides. So one of the downsides is, as the person doing the work, was the regular updates to Data Factory. So unlike, say, an on-prem tool where you get to control when new versions of the software are delivered, right? Oh, there's a new version of DataStage or a new version of SSIS. When do you want to apply that? I don't know. When do you think? What's changed? But with cloud tools, you usually have no control. You come in the next day and, oh, guess what? We upgraded your environment and things change and stuff stops working. And you're looking at your code going, oh, why doesn't this run? Well, because we changed things and now your pipelines don't run anymore. And that can be pretty annoying because you get calls from the client.
That's hardly a feature.
Yeah, it's not exactly a feature.
Our new feature is we break your pipeline.
Yeah, we broke your pipelines and the client's calling you early in the morning going, my reports didn't get delivered. So there are some issues there, and there's, centrally managed security, which is awesome, and rotating security keys, which are great to take advantage of, but it just shifts sort of where things traditionally have been taken care of in maybe an internal IT department to an external resource that may or may not have the same priorities as you do. So if you have something that breaks, you might be subject to a 4, 8, 12, 24-hour SLA, and that may or may not work well for you. So it was an interesting process to go through and see how that worked for them. Most days it was good, but some days it was particularly bad. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. That's my example.
Yeah, Brad, that reminds me just one of the challenges I've seen with either all cloud environments that are all cloud, or at least environments that are mostly cloud, that a big risk that a lot of people don't necessarily realize they're stepping into with that is the dependency you're talking about, where you're dependent on the vendor of each distinct cloud tool that you're using to keep their tool operating successfully, right? And if their service goes down, it can have dramatic impacts on, like the example you gave about Data Factory. I can recall some of those experiences where, Microsoft pushed an update and, they don't really announce it. And the way they tend to roll out the updates, they sort of roll over time and kind of across the continent. So you don't necessarily know when your systems are going to start being affected by a new update. Or even when they start rolling it back, like they periodically would have to roll things back. It was unpredictable. And in some ways, historically, we'd always complain, oh, it takes IT, too long to fix a problem we have. But I would say, at least when you have, in that situation, you had somebody you could kind of go to directly and say, hey, I need help. And you could get kind of much more real-time updates about what was happening. And I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
Nowadays it's more, it's not, it's sort of opaque. That's the word I would use. What's going on is more opaque.
Right. And I think that, if you're a big company and you're paying for high-level premium support, you can probably get somebody on the phone. But if you're kind of a mid-range business and you're not willing to pay a very large amount for that kind of support, then you're going to not have that direct feedback that you would have by being able to just call your buddy down the hall and say, that upgrade didn't work, roll it back. So yeah, it definitely was a different thing. And 99.8% uptime is that 0.2% can be pretty painful.
Yeah, if it happens at the wrong time.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't think about like, oh, 0.2%, that's nothing. Yeah, until it's that hour that you need the system to run. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and to that point, Brad, I mean, you have, there are common situations where these kinds of systems are heavily used, right? Like, let's say beginning of the quarter or end of year. And so, of course, all of these cloud platforms have a much heavier load at that time. And that's also the most critical time for a lot of execs to be getting their data. And, if that 0.02% or 0.2% downtime happens to occur, first thing in the morning on one of these critical days, like, it can be a big, big problem.
Yes.
Right. Yep. So anyway, just a little bit of perspective on being totally cloud-based is has its own downsides. So yeah, that's my example.
Great. Well, thanks, Brad. A thing I thought of as you guys were talking, I don't know offhand how much of this you've seen, but I'll just ask you. I'm curious about multiple tool environments. So I know, historically you tend to have adoption of like one platform, right? Like a company would choose SSIS and do everything that way. But kind of out in today's world with this broad landscape of all these new tools, do you still mostly see that organizations are kind of adopting one platform and sticking with it? Or do you see hybrid in the sense of like multiple different tools kind of working together?
So on my side, most of them have been a singular tool, but as management might change or you get new IT staff that's coming in, you may lose. In this case, we've had folks that were on Informatica, and some of the new staff that came in really didn't understand it as well as maybe a SSIS. And so they, sort of started a new project, going to the tool that they knew best. And so that, that slowly but surely you started to build up of a multitude of, different routines, some in Informatica, some in SSIS, just because of turnovers of folks that have come in and, take things over. And then you get back to now where they're trying to re-synergize and go to a singular solution in Azure in the cloud. So it's an ongoing event that just you may start at one point, but with internal changes and folks that knew the tool and knew the application and knew what it was doing, it's then cause of issue of folks introducing another tool set just because of their familiarity with the different tool set than what was currently in place. At least for this one client, that was what contributed to it. But there's others where we definitely go in and say we want to consolidate. Yes, we may be using a multitude of different ETL routines, and we need to consolidate across the board. And I've been in some where different one organization had Informatica, had Data Stage, had SSIS, and was looking to go to a completely different solution as their integrated solution.
So just to consolidate all three of those
into something else. Yes.
Oh wow.
So. And that and that's
not for the faint of heart.
No, definitely not for the faint of heart. But yeah, it just depends on the organization. Sometimes things, departmentally, things crop up, and that's where you get the multitude of data integration tools. Just like you end up with departmental uses of maybe Tableau or business objects, or Power BI and even Cognos, just in departmental wise usage. So It same thing is true on the data integration side.
Yeah, sometimes it's based on economics too. I had one client who was on Informatica, and there's an annual licensing fee involved there, but they didn't want to pay that anymore, so they brought in SSIS, and I migrated some of their ETL routines from Informatica to SSIS. There's planning to sunset Informatica at that place, so sometimes it's economy.
I think it's
So how
more,
difficult? Oh,
sorry,
actually, go ahead, Brad.
I was just
I'll hold my question.
All right, we'll get all three of us in. I just wanted to comment that I found that it's more and more common now to find multiple tools. It used to be there was one vendor involved and people tended to be pretty monolithic, but in the last 5+ years, it seems like everybody's got multiple tools. It's I would say more likely that people have multiple tools than not. We still, at least at Senturus, we have clients who have a single tool, but I think they're in the minority.
I think you're finding that more with cloud-based solutions too. Going from a cloud source to, and you got multiple ways of getting data from there into, for instance, Snowflake. So they use different tools for, and even like Ruby scripts and stuff to move data.
Yeah, especially if you throw in data prep tools, like if you throw in Tableau prep or some other, something that you wouldn't call a heavy lifter, you're definitely going to find a proliferation of tools for loading data. Yeah.
Yeah, I would guess that the existence of so many cloud-based tools also, I don't know, sort of accelerates that proliferation of using multiple tools, just because the sort of friction, there's less friction with getting started, right? I mean, if I can go drop my credit card into a cloud-based tools portal and get a month of service for a small amount of money, it's a lot easier than getting approval in my organization to purchase licenses for a big tool. But I also think that can be a false economy, because then you have the question of what does it actually take to use the tool effectively and integrate it with your other tools.
Yeah, well, the usual hurdle is data access, right? I mean, you can buy a service and get set up, but then the first time you try to access that database that's behind a firewall somewhere, it's like, oh, whoops, they won't let me in, and that's a pretty good roadblock. But
All right, guys. Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour here. A couple of quick questions still. I was curious, Rick, when you were talking about the example of changing platforms, I think it was Informatica to SSIS was the example you gave a moment ago. How difficult is that? I mean, is it straightforward to migrate, or is it some heavy lifting to switch like that?
As far as I know, there's no tool that's going to do the migration of the code for you. So you basically have to open up, on Informatica side and look through, see where, how all the lookups are being done, any transformations that are happening, and then kind of translate that into SSIS. So it's not an easy thing to do. And I think we've done some data manager to data stage migrations too. Same thing. You have to know both tools, go in there, open it up. You have to go everywhere to find logic, what's being done to the data, and then rewrite it in the whatever tool you're migrating to. So yeah, it's not an easy process. I don't know of any migration tool that allows you to do that.
And I would say I was just the opposite. I've been on projects where we've gone from SSIS to Informatica, and the same thing. You have to open up the tool sets, and it almost leads to at that point, it's more of a re-engineering thought of what was wrong with or what improvements could we make with the existing process, that because the process was so so integrated to whatever we're doing, we're not going to break things. But if we had a chance to start over, which in a tool migration you actually are, you can actually think about what things would we have done differently now that we have, been having the system run, for a period of time. What changes will we make to the process to make it easier to maintain, more efficient? What things could we do? So that opens up, a little bit when you start talking about, tool migrations, gives you the idea, the ability to think about what could we do differently, or are we just going to do, apples to apples migration, so we have some form of testing, to ensure that the process is still delivering us the same result sets.
Yep.
But doing it, in between, how can we get a little bit more efficient in how we process the data?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when you gave your example initially, Rick, you said basically they didn't want to pay the license fee, right? They were trying to save on licensing costs, and that was
Yeah.
kind of the driver for that switch.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the additional, not insignificant cost of what it actually takes to do that migration work. All right, gang. Well, so we're coming up to the end here. So I'm going to call it a wrap on our roundtable discussion. I'm going to show the deck here again, but we'll all still be here. So thanks everybody for joining today. If you do have questions beyond what we covered here in the discussion today, you can always reach out to us, info@senturus.com. You can click on Scott Felton's Calendly link there in the chat window. We're always happy to talk to you about your current challenges. If you want to do a deep dive on topics we discussed today, again, just reach out to us, visit our website. We're happy to talk. You can also find lots of additional resources on the Senturus website. We've been in this business for a long time, so there's a wealth of information out there on our site, so check that out. Lots of details about the tools we've discussed today and others. A little bit about upcoming events. We got a bunch of stuff coming up. We've got Chat with Pat sessions. Whoops, sorry about that. I overclicked, double overclicked. There we go. We've got a Chat with Pat on Power Query Editor for data cleansing coming up later this month. Power BI data marts. We'll have a session on Cognos Analytics performance tuning. For those of you who are Cognos folks, don't miss that. We'll have our own Todd Schumann, expert on all things Cognos, to cover that, and another Chat with Pat on how to do building good visualizations in Tableau. You can register for any of these at senturus.com/events. Here at Senturus, we specialize in modern BI, particularly in hybrid environments. Nowadays, we see a lot of Cognos, Power BI, Tableau in various combinations. We're happy to help you out with all of that. We've been in business for 22 years now, over 1,400 clients, over 3,000 projects. So we've got a lot under our belts. Just between the three experts on the call here today, a bunch of these clients and projects have all been touched by these guys over the years. So you're in good hands with us. That's the point. If you're looking to change positions, we are hiring. We're looking for a senior Microsoft BI consultant. So if that is of interest to you, jump over to our site, visit senturus.com, Senturus Careers, or you can just send your resume straight to us at jobs@senturus.com. All right, and with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. Brad, Rick, Peter, thank you guys for being here as the experts for today's roundtable discussion. Great to have you. And thank you everybody for attending. We hope to see you again on a future Senturus webinar. Thanks everyone.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
Steve.
day.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.